In today's podcast, we are going to be introducing a little bit more about our new format, our new features, our new subject, maybe our special editions here back at the Widow Wisdom and Wealth podcast. Tune in, learn a little bit about our intentions for this podcast, who we're going to be interviewing, and how we're going to be sharing information in a way that entertains, in a way that aligns with the experiences of others and how we can learn from them. I'm so excited to get started. Listen in. Hi, my name is Donna Kendrick, and I am the owner of Sefton Financial and founder. That is my maiden name. And I am also the author of A Guide to Widowhood, Navigating the First 3 Years with Your Heart, Soul, and Finances Intact, as well as a guide for blended families, merging assets and navigating financial challenges. And I am also your podcast host to the Widow Wisdom and Wealth podcast. Now, some of you might have already subscribed to Widow Wisdom and Wealth. And this is a little bit of a new format. So I'm here today to kind of let you know about what direction we're taking our podcast. Now, in the beginning, we were giving financial guidance, a bit of education, with a kind of flavor towards leaning to our clients that are in transition, our families in transition, people in widowhood, divorce, and blended families. That's kind of our wheelhouse. And so we were just putting the podcast out there with some of the current topics, some of the current decisions, like whether it be tax time, whether it be end of year, whether you're navigating the early days of a loss. And then later, a few years later, we introduced my husband, Jim. I am a widow of 12 years, and 2 years ago, I got remarried to Jim. And Jim comes with a different flavor to the podcast. I am a financial advisor. Jim is a carpenter by trade. And so he joined in on the podcast for a few different reasons. One, to help keep me grounded, to make sure that when I was sharing information and education onto our podcast, that I wasn't quote unquote talking overhead. I wasn't using too much jargon. I wasn't so deep into the investments and telling people about tax deferred and tax free and qualified and non-qualified and brokerage and investments and advisory, that I was really talking to the person in their car, worried about being able to stay on budget, worried about whether they should accept a new job, worried about how to negotiate Social Security so they can feed their kids in widowhood, to remember that that was the message that people were listening for. And while I think Jim did a really good job of keeping me grounded and keeping the conversation really on point for what listeners wanted to hear. But what we realized is that Jim has actually been my Jim before my Jim. Jim and I were friends. He was a construction worker who worked in my house to help me renovate it after the loss of my husband. Um, the kids and I had moved about 2 years after my first husband, Gregory, passed, and Jim was helping like with drywall and like helping me fix cement work and brickwork in the house. Like he was kind of like that handyman. And it took him a few years to get all of the jobs done. And yeah, I ran out of money on that budget. We'll be talking about that. But during that time, he actually watched me move from those first early years of widowhood to recreating my career, to raising my kids as a sole parent. In widowhood, you don't quite have another parent out there to take the kids on weekends, right? To navigating my heart, my worries, my finances. And so he was kind of that third party watching from afar. And that's kind of where we got the idea for how to move our Widow Wisdom and Wealth podcast from kind of that educational based financial conversation to real life experiences. And so, in these new versions of Widow, Wisdom, and Wealth, we're going to be talking about thriving in your career and parenthood after loss. Jim watched me go back to school. He watched me flip my career on its head. You'll hear in a future podcast, he was probably the motivating force that said, quit that part-time job, go back to school full time, and just jump all in. We call it the F it moment. Yeah, I have to be careful what we say on podcasts to keep it classy. But like, okay, like I'm just going to do this. And I really feel I'm in alignment for it. Um, and if I could focus all of my energy on it, how can I make it work? And then Jim stepped out of my life for a long time because, yeah, I ran out of money for that home improvement budget. And we reconnected for several years later when his first marriage had ended through divorce. And he found a new me, someone who had been established for a few years in a career, someone who was about ready to break out on my own. We call it hanging your own shingle, having my own practice. Um, and there was a huge difference. So we shared a lot of our reconnecting because it'd been 5 years or so since we had really spent time together in a conversation, even about what would that journey look like? What did that path look like? And who I was as that person in front of him now. Since that time, in the past 2 years, Jim's ex-wife has passed away. And so it's also weird that he is in this like widower situation, but he's remarried, but he was divorced, so he's not. But with that comes a lot of dynamics on finances, a lot of dynamics on raising kids, a lot of dynamics on blending families. And wow, Jim and I did not know that this is the path that we were going to be going on when we decided to blend our families. We really just knew we loved one another, and we both were very happy in marriages. We both really loved that structure for our kids, and we were willing to try it again. So that's a little bit of the motivation for this change. I really want to focus this podcast on sharing from these journeys of other widows and widowers, of when they faced the loss, sharing their story. How did they either recreate their career, maintain their career, expand their career? And what did this journey of widowhood do to them as a person? How did it change their perspective when they were in their career or looking to change or looking to launch their own business? And how did they lean in? Who helped them? Was there any help? What systems did they put in place to make sure that they could be a sole parent? There's many times no one else to turn to. Decisions you make are yours and you are fully responsible for them. As a parent, we talk about decisions, we mean parenting decisions, like what's the curfew? Do they get an allowance? What's the consequence if the homework wasn't done? How do you maintain mm, picking up a sick kid when you might be in the office an hour and a half from home? How did you, how did our listeners, how did our storytellers, how did they manage this thing called widowhood? And what wisdoms do they gain from it? I have learned over the past few years that when we share our stories, when we are earnest, when we come to the genuine point of life, when sometimes you want to make sure no one worries about you, that you're going to be okay, when you know that's over, and you can share the wisdom, that genuine point of life of how did that work for you? Sometimes we step in potholes, right? And what do we learn from each of those potholes? How did it make us a better CEO? How did it make us a better business owner? How did it make us a better parent? How did it make us a better partner? Should we be dating again? Or with our in-laws from our lost spouse? How do we navigate that? What resources did we use? What worked for our kids? What didn't? And when we share these stories about being sole parents that are trying to keep food on the table, expand our careers, and raise our kids, when we can share those journeys, we learn from one another. And that's what we're here to do. So, how is this new podcast system going to be set up? Well, you're not always going to be hearing from me. Many of times you're going to be hearing from myself and some of my guests, my widows and widowers, and they're going to share a little bit about their story about loss. They're going to share a little bit about what worked with them, what was their family structure at the time, what support systems did they have in place. Um, how did things feel very different after the loss? The first year, the second year, when this is the new reality, what did things change? What things changed? What did they feel like they had control of? What was some great advice? that they would actually be able to share with some of our listeners moving forward. That is kind of be the structure of our conversations of this new format. And then maybe on a following podcast, there might be, see, I call them like golden nuggets, little gems from that interview, from that journey, from that guest story. And Jim and I will actually discuss it from his point of view and from mine. Um, and really kind of digging deep, like, wow, that was so valuable. I never thought of hiring a college graduate, for example, to watch my kids from 3 to 5 so that they could finish up dinner and get some of the baseball practice. So I could roll in right after the end of the business day and everything was kind of moving, homework, food, right? That 2 hour transition support that we needed. An example like that. We'll talk that through. And then in some of our podcasts, we'll have guests, some of our estate attorneys, some of our accountants, some of our gurus in personal management of budgets, right? What are some of the budgeting systems that worked, right? Maybe some of our life coaches and family coaches, how to negotiate some of these hard conversations with extended families, because everyone wants the best interest of us, we hope, or the best interest of our kids, but grief and communication can get really foggy at times. So that's kind of the setup. We're going to invite guests that we think can really share some value on how they manage sole parenting while building their careers and raising their kids. We're going to ask them for their wisdom, what worked, what didn't work. And then we're going to figure out how we dig deeper so that maybe some of those great pieces, those great resources, how do we kind of flesh those out so that our listeners can learn how to apply them into their own lives? We want you, the listeners, to know if you're in widowhood or sole parenting, um, or in a divorce situation, many of times, some of those rules, some of those conversations are similar, that you're not alone, that we've done it, that there's other people, our guests, that have done it. And we want you to know that, how would my dad say it? There's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Maybe the solutions that worked for me as a widow didn't work for you, right? Or maybe that's a great idea, but how do I put it into place? And we want to actually share the talking points of what worked for you. We want you to go back to your communities. I have found that widows hang with widows, widowers hang with widowers, and people that are building their career like to go back to work and sometimes say, hey, I just did a podcast where I shared a little of my journey. What did it feel like for you watching me as a widow those first 2 years, back at work? Right? What were some of the things that you guys might have put into place as my office community that I didn't even realize? Flexible work schedule, ability to share documents, ability to work virtually. Um, yeah. And to bring that back to the table, right? To use our conversation on the podcast to ask our community, how did this impact you? Let's keep learning. We never stop. And sometimes when we move outside of our own boundaries in life, when we continue to learn and expand, it's really how we improve and how we grow. And for many, I think this podcast could be actually be like a little bio of like, this is a little bit more about me. I know I was incredibly private as a widow and a widower, at least for the first 2 years. And it's when I actually expanded my practice and decided to niche down to really serving families in transition that I became really genuine. It took a long time, like years, for me to say out loud that we lost my first husband to suicide. I used to always just say we lost him suddenly and that we had to react. But when you actually add that, yeah, it was a death by suicide, there's a layer of understanding as to the grief, as to the little battles I might have had with some self-worth, right? And it expands, right? So let's share these genuine conversations and let's share these new tips and these new considerations and let's share our wisdom. I can't wait to join in with this new format for you, and I hope it brings a lot of abundance and joy to your life. Thanks.